Hiya, this video is like a follow-up then to part one. First video talks you through all of your physical case studies. This video does the opposite then, it talks you through all of your human case studies. As ever, there are individual videos on every single one of these case studies. You just need to look them up. So this is like a whistle-stop tour and a bit of a recap then of all of the case studies you will need for your paper 2 exam. Paper 2 has the following topics on it. So section A is urban issues and challenges. Section B is about the changing economic world, and section C is all about resource management. There are no case studies here on food or energy because we have chosen to answer the water option. You'll see a list here of all of the case studies you need and for which bits you'll need them for. So if you don't already know this, it might be a good idea just to take a screen grab of this now if you haven't done so already. So if we start with the first big case study, the first case study you need for urban issues and challenges is Lagos in Nigeria. Lagos in Nigeria is your case study of a major city that's in an NEE. And essentially for this one, you need to know what's causing it to grow there, and you need to know a bit about opportunity and challenge as well. So they've got really big urban sprawl. They've got about 15 million people at the moment. It's continuing to boom. The area is continuing to grow, with a lot of the population living in informal housing. Informal housing is slums, so people there that are living perhaps without running water or appropriate hygiene, and without sort of bricks and mortar in a house. So there's lots of reasons behind this growth. The main two are natural increase, so that's when the birth rate exceeds the death rate. You've also got a really high rate of rural to urban migration, so there's lots of people that are moving to the city, about 500,000 a year. So this throws up big challenges in terms of water and sanitation and energy, but also if they have appropriate access also to services as well. 37% of the population are illiterate, so cannot read and write. You've got about 1.95 doctors to every 1,000 people. You've got communal toilets that are shared between approximately 15 families. And I suppose that throws up huge opportunity though at the same time. So yes, there are some downsides, and those are the ones we just talked about, but there's huge opportunity here in terms of the fact that most of the population here are trying to develop businesses and are trying to gain greater access to a range of facilities. So there is a better range of healthcare in the city, for example. There's 68% of the population in theory accessing secondary education. You've only got 60% of the population accessing primary within rural areas. In theory, education is better. Because it's on the coast, you've got some access to shipping and a sheltered harbour. The international airport and the road and rail links make this a really sort of accessible centre for industry. But I suppose you've got to balance that a little bit with some of the challenges that this area is facing. And the fact that only 40% of their rubbish is collected poses huge issues for environmental quality. However, you could flip that and say, well, it is also a huge opportunity at the same time, and the amount of people that work on the rubbish dump are a brilliant example of how informal employment really does work for a local community. Air traffic as well is one big challenge they've got. There is little legislation on emissions and traffic congestion, and so this population seems to be growing, but with little sort of control over what they can and can't do with regards to traffic. Only 10% of water is piped, so therefore you might say, well, what's the quality of water like? And most of it contains sewage or it's really poor quality, so you need to drink bottled. You've got some areas like Makoko, for example, that are developed over the water because they've run out of space on land. And one big challenge there is if the sea level continues to rise, it's likely that these homes will flood. So one solution they've offered to this is tempo housing. Tempo housing is making homes out of recycled shipping containers. They're pretty good. They're 25% cheaper than a normal home. They can build them in 7 days. They can stack them 9 stories high. They don't have to just be used for homes. They can make hospitals and schools out of these. But the downside is it costs about 2 million naira, which is about £4,300 in British money. So some people might say, well, it's still pretty expensive. The local people aren't massively fond of them. They think there's a bit of a stigma attached to living in them. They worry about the sort of sense of community being lost if you stack 9 stories high. But to balance that, some people say, well, the living conditions are better in these, And if you can afford them, this is almost like the next step up then from living in informal housing. So it's trying to offer sort of a bit more of a solution to some of the issues that we just discussed. And so if we consider sort of the importance then of Nigeria, where Lagos is, you've got to know why this is such an important country, why we're studying it. And Nigeria is known as the giant of Africa. It's got a population of about 184 million. It's changed, it's grown from an LIC to an NEE. It's got some of the fastest growing businesses and economies within it. So by 2050, it's predicted it's going to be the 11th largest economy in the world. So it's growing really rapidly and it's growing fast. Some context here about Nigeria as well for those that are interested. I think this is quite interesting to me personally, but you've got essentially 500 different ethnic groups there. A lot of the vegetation that was natural has been replaced by agriculture. It suffered a civil war in 1967 to 1970. There's still a bit of conflict in the north. We'll talk about that very, very shortly. But Nigeria seems to have dealt with things very well. It took on the Ebola crisis. And so you might say, right, actually, yep, economic development's booming here as well, but sort of the social care and stuff going on with the population also seems to be growing slightly to match it now. It actually makes it quite an interesting place, I think, to look at and to study. I suppose because it is that interesting, it's attracting lots of TNCs as well. There was a huge boom in the oil industry in the 1970s in Nigeria. So you've got Shell Company, for example, started drilling platforms and shipping it back to places like the UK. Gcse Cement is sort of more of a local example. It's a Nigerian company, but it operates across 10 African countries, creates around 36,000 jobs. So those bring huge positives with it. So some of the profit does stay within Nigeria itself. It's developing the skills of the local people. In theory, they're paying higher wages than on average for the country, so it's pretty good. But to counter that, a lot of this money is leaving Nigeria and going back to the host country. So, for example, the UK profits quite a lot off of Gcse Cement and off of Shell Oil because their profits are being sent back to where their offices or their headquarters are. And so therefore you might say, well, Nigeria's not getting all of that money. They do have big political influence. So, for example, if Shell Oil don't agree with Nigerians' policies, they might try and sway the government's decision a little bit. And they're not paying the people in Nigeria as much as they would pay workers in a HIC. So again, TNC are benefiting a little bit here because they're not having to shell out as much money on wages, etc., as they would do if this company was in the UK. However, you could say it's having a really positive impact on trade and the trading relationships. And you might say, well, it's attracting loads of investment then into Nigeria and helping to develop infrastructure as well. One big thing that's come out of this is the relationship between China and Nigeria. And China's sort of bringing its experience to Nigeria and helping to build a 1,400 kilometre railway along the coast of Nigeria to support trade. It's investing in oil fields and in raw mineral extraction. So you might say, well, actually, again, they're attracting loads of economic investment. So in theory now, Nigeria has a bit more cash to sort of aid and to support its development as well. Interestingly, to talk about aid then, there's a lot of international aid that's happening in the form of mosquito nets. Sadly, Nigeria's got one of the highest death rates from malaria. And so attracting a lot of this investment's pretty good in trying to help them overcome this and try and manage it. The UK gives £300 million a year to Nigeria. Notice here I've said, well, critics point out that Nigeria don't need this money if they've got a programme. But the UK sort of responds and sort of says, well, actually, you've still got people here that are living on less than $1.25 a day, so they do need the cash. If we think about this oil industry and the economic development and how this sort of goes hand in hand with sort of social care and social quality for people, you might say, well, there's still quite a big gap here, isn't there? Economic development seems to be accelerating and going really quickly and benefiting Nigeria hugely, but yet sort of the standard of social care is still sort of yet to catch up a little bit. You've got big issues with the oil industry and the damage that it's caused the environment. You've got wetlands and ecosystems that have been ruined due to oil spills. You've got local communities' way of life that's been impacted. In particular, fishing industry has suffered quite a lot as a result. And so some of the rural communities, you might argue here, are really worse off because of the oil industry. They now can't complete their own way of life. They can't go fishing or farming, for example, due to the damage caused to the land. So you might say, well, actually, yeah, it's great for some people, but it's not benefited everybody. But on the whole, quality of life seems to be improving. New jobs, new wages, that's all on the rise. There are big divides between the north and the south. There seems to be a bit of a north-south divide. In the south, it's very urban, lots of development. In the north, still much very rural community that is lacking some access to education. So if we compare this then to London, again, if we look at the importance of London, hopefully we'll know where London's located, but it's southeast England. London is a world city. Essentially means it's got links to the world. It's known on a global scale. Population continuing to rise. It's just shy of 9 million at the moment. Really young population. Majority of people are under 30. And so you've got to really know opportunities and challenges. What's attracting those people there? So one big opportunity or one area experiencing opportunity within London is Notting Hill. Notting Hill was originally a working class area. It was the scene of the race riots in the 1950s. And this area has undergone some gentrification. It's had some small scale changes to it that have had a pretty big impact. It's got wealthier people moving in. It's now a very popular area of London, all because of a few licks of paint, a little bit of policy changing in the area, some new shops, etc. that are moving in. So house prices have risen from just under £12,000 now to about £2 million of property. You've got lots of cafes. You've got a famous Notting Hill market and carnival every single year that really attracts the tourists. So it's an area really that's undergone a complete transformation. So you might say, well, that's a huge opportunity. I would absolutely agree with you. You've also got integrated rail transport, so Crossrail, another huge opportunity here. In theory, we're more connected. It's going to reduce journey times, increase the number of passengers into London by 10%. So it's going to bring in approximately an extra 1.5 million people into the area, or that within a 45-minute drive of the area. The downside to this is that those people who live along the Crossrail route are expected to see a rise in property price of 25%. So it's now going to make property or homes that are along the Crossrail route even more expensive to buy. So you might say, well, that's a big downside because it's going to outprice quite a few people. However, if you've got that many people now in theory that can access London, it might kickstart even more gentrification or regeneration, just like we saw with Notting Hill. Urban greening is another strategy. Urban greening is trying to increase the amount of green space you have within an urban area. So with London, for example, they're trying to protect the amount of green space they've got. They're looking at increasing the amount of green roofs, so planting on top of big skyscrapers. They've got about 700 currently. Looking at planting more walls and sides of buildings, etc. In the Olympic Park, they planted 4,000 new trees and tried to create new habitats along the river. So there's now a huge shift on not just social and economic regeneration, but also looking after the environment as well. So with all of those wonderful benefits comes challenges. So you've got some urban inequalities here. So you've still got deprivation. You've still got a relatively low life expectancy in the east. You've got a relatively high crime rate in some places as well. However, you've also got some urban sprawl. So London's growing by about 100,000 people every year. However, they're only building about 20,000 new homes, so it can only house 20% of this new population that are coming into London. Perhaps one solution to this is to use brownfield sites. So these are areas that have previously been developed and they're redeveloping them again. So you then might also see the rise of things like commuter towns. So Reading, for example, where we are, is a commuter town to London. It's just simply to help people cope with the rising house prices and lack of accommodation that there is within London. So one example of regeneration within London would be the Olympic Park in Stratford. So they chose this area because they've got lots of brownfield sites, factories are closed, there was high unemployment. Household incomes are about just under £29,000. The London average, to compare it with, is about £37,000. So relatively low quality of life. You've got land and water that's polluted. So this regeneration project took on this almost village or housing estate. It put in 10,000 new homes, tried to make it sort of the hub for the creative industry, built in the Westfield shopping centre, the new park, and tried to sort of create this environmental area that was protected. They connected it, and again, they've opened a new school as well. So trying to turn around this little pocket within London, and the Elizabeth Olympic Park would be a nice successful example of recent regeneration within London. So successes here. Well, socially, the local people are benefiting from these brand new facilities and homes. Economically, they've got improved transport links, so they can now look for better work opportunities. Environmentally, water quality is improved. They've got brand new protected green spaces as well. However, this does create problems for us. So we've got old blocks of flats that are demolished and residents have no choice but to move out. So you've got displacement of local people. The taxpayers had a high cost here. They've had to pay for this project. House prices also have gone up. So now it poses the question that can the people that were there before, the local people, now afford to live within the area? Before this, you had another regeneration project. You had London Docklands. This was about 1981. The London Docklands before that had been abandoned. It was a site of shipping into London. The brand new container ships that were bigger now couldn't access the channels. The shipping yard that was there became unused, and lots of unemployed workers were living in very poor inner city houses. So to regenerate this, they knocked down the whole area, built some brand new skyscrapers and office blocks, and the local people that were there before were forced to move out in favour of these brand new office blocks. So positives, you might say, well, it's attracted in new businesses, loads of new revenue, health and education services improved. Criticisms of this, well, it didn't benefit the local people, the homes are now too expensive, and the people that were there before couldn't even use the new jobs or employment opportunities were there, they just didn't have the skills for it. So one of the final examples you've got within urban issues is Curitiba and Dubai. These are your examples of sustainable urban living. In Curitiba, they did a few things to try and be more sustainable. They had solution of the parks, and this is where if they wanted to develop within Curitiba or in the city, they couldn't go and build a brand new office building straight away. Instead, if they already had one, developers were offering them the chance to put a few more stories onto the buildings they already had in exchange for a little bit of cash to build a park at the top or bottom of the building. Their waste recycling, 2/3 of their rubbish is collected and recycled. They've got the green exchange programme, where those people that are living down homes with narrow lanes take their rubbish to the truck and get it weighed and exchange it for bus tickets or extra food that they're about to throw out. So again, that's pretty positive, isn't it? Dubai, have got all houses facing north to try and reduce their air conditioning needs. They're recycling water. Their recycled water then used in things like parks, for things like water fountains, etc. And huge pedestrianised streets. So they're trying to encourage the use of walking rather than different modes of transport. If we move on to economic world then, one case study you'll need here is Tunisia. Tunisia is an example of how tourism can help to reduce the development gap. Tourism brings about 6 million people into Tunisia every single year. It's pretty popular, it's got a lovely climate, it's quite close to Europe, it's got some UNESCO heritage sites there, but more importantly for some people is the cheap package holidays, so it's quite affordable for people to want to visit Tunisia. So it's helped to reduce the development gap here. Incomes for local people have quadrupled. Literacy rates increased from 66 to 79%. It makes up about 8% of GDP for the country. And exposure to other cultures has resulted in now women and girls accessing more higher education. So you might say, well, this is really positive actually. It's helping to narrow down the development gap, and I'd be inclined to agree with you. You've also got a case study here of the UK economy. It's quite useful, I think, just to compare some of the big changes that have gone on. For us, deindustrialisation is one thing that we've talked about quite a lot, and a shift now from manufacturing to more office-based work and the quaternary industry. Previously, we had about 3,000 coal mines, now we've got 0. We've got shipyards, for example, that are closing in the north of England. And so as geographers, we're interested in what impact this is having on the rest of the UK. We're moving towards more of a post-industrial economy now, so less of a focus on manufacturing and more of a focus on research, development and the service industry. So the M4 corridor is a really good example of this. Along the M4, you've often got lots of businesses and high-tech industry located in sort of retail parks, and they're choosing to locate there because you've got the M4 as sort of an easy transport link between all of this, and it helps to attract this highly skilled workforce because it makes commuting fairly easy. Jaguar Land Rover is another big example that you may wish to use here. I would use Jaguar Land Rover more of an example of how industry can be more environmentally sustainable within the UK. If you're asked about this in the exam, this is the one that I would use. Jaguar Land Rover has built a brand new factory in Wolverhampton. They're trying to cut down on their energy use and carbon emissions. They're trying to be really careful with their water usage as part of their manufacturing process. And they're trying also to send zero waste to landfill for their UK operation. So essentially they're trying to continue their manufacturing business, but at very little cost to the environment. And it's attracting a bit more business back, dare we say it, to Wolverhampton. So you might say, well, actually, it's not only having a positive impact for the environment, it's also continuing to shape and mould that workforce, shall we say, within Wolverhampton and keep some of the opportunity for employment there and within the UK instead of outsourcing it abroad to countries like China. You've got some big changes happening in the rural parts of the UK. Some rural areas are thriving, so like North Somerset, for example. We're seeing a bit of counter-urbanisation here. You've got a lot of commuters that are living within North Somerset and commuting into places like London because it's on that growth corridor, the M4. It's close to Devon, so again, big pull here is you've got areas of outstanding national beauty. You're not too far from the coast, but also you can quite easily get into London if you needed to, which has caused some problems for the local people there. Increased road congestion and house prices are falling. But you then have, I suppose, to counter that, some areas that are also in decline. So places like South Lakeland, for example, in the Lake District, used to be a manufacturing area, but because of the manufacturing area declining, it's resulted, unfortunately, in huge job losses and lack of job opportunities. So the population there is declining. Lots of the young people in the younger workforce are choosing to move out of the area, and so as a result, you've got fewer people paying taxes and sort of investing back into improving this local area. Transport improvements, again, you may wish to use this within the economic development or economic world topic, the second sort of chapter on the exam. Again, you've got things like smart motorways, which is the longest project in England, covering 32 miles. Smart motorways are where you change your motorway from 3 lanes to 4 lanes. To do this, though, you've got to change 11 bridges. It's causing lots of traffic disruption. And actually now the government's come out and said, oh, they're not very good. They cause too many accidents. So I don't think they're continuing with that project anymore. HS2 or High Speed Railway 2 is trying to reduce journey time to Birmingham by about 25 minutes and Manchester by an hour. So hopefully encouraging more businesses to locate outside of London. It's very expensive. It's cost about £42 billion. Heathrow putting in a brand new runway. So that's projected to boost the UK economy by about £200 billion. It's going to prevent, however, the UK from reaching its carbon emission reduction target. So yes, it's having huge benefit to the economy, but also it's got big drawbacks for the environment here. Last but not least, the final topic on resource management sees the SNWTP, or China's North-South Water Project. It's transferring 44.8 billion cubic litres of water from the south to the north of China. You've got 200 million people in the north of the country, basically, that need better access to water. They have a water surplus in the south, so they're pumping this water north to try and help the population. So big advantages here is it's going to provide a reliable water supply. It's going to support the development of industry. It's going to be used to irrigate farmland, so crops. Disadvantages, look how many there are. It's going to flood habitats. You've got huge construction works. It's going to flood farmland. The project only is going to benefit those in urban areas. It won't go out to rural communities. It might cause water stress within the south now, as some of that supply is being diverted north. Also, they've had to build huge dams to be able to store some of the water. And so to build a dam, you've got to flood huge areas of land. So some critics of this are saying, well, it's causing actually far too much environmental damage just for the gain of the population in the north. So last but not least then is a smaller example. So we've also looked at Kenyan sand dams. This is an example of a scheme then that wants to sustainably increase water supply. Kenya has a hot, dry climate. This is why they need them. The water comes in the rainy season and they're trying to store some of that water so they can access it all year round. The picture shows you here that you build the dam, the sand becomes deposited behind it, the water is then underneath, and so when the river dries, basically you dig a well through the sand to get to the water that's underneath. So these are hugely sustainable because they're using local materials that are placed really easily, a local workforce builds them, they are pretty low cost, and they can just raise the dam every single year. So it lasts year upon year upon year with very little maintenance and not a huge startup cost. So out of the two, the SNWTP or Kenyan sand dams, if it asks you about sustainable water supply, I'd be really tempted to write about Kenyan sand dams because I think these are more sustainable than that huge north-south water transfer project. So that's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour, I know, but it's covered all of the case studies you need for paper 2 and hopefully has been a bit of a refresher for you. If you need any more detail on any of those case studies, please go back and look at the individual videos that I've made. Failing that, go and talk to your geography teacher if you have any questions. The very best of luck with your revision.